Hi, everyone. Welcome to another two-bottle tasting series here at WineSpectatorTastings.com. I am Keith Goldston, your Master Sommelier for Landry's Corp. And I've got with me today Advanced Sommelier Julie Dalton, who is the lead sommelier for Mastro's Grand Award Wine Program at the Post Oak Hotel in Houston. So welcome, Julie.
Welcome. Thank you.
And we've got a really fun theme today. Besides having Mastro's be the food sponsor with their amazing meal kit, offering two different cuts of their award-winning steaks. We've also got two phenomenal red wines, and I'm really privileged and honored to work with them and taste with them, share with you today. One is from BV Vineyards in Napa Valley, and it's their Tapestry, which is spectacular. And then we also go way down under to Penfolds and the Barossa Valley, well, actually all over Australia, and their Bin 389. So this is kind of a fun one. This isn't necessarily like, let's talk about, one specific region. These are just both phenomenal wines that kind of fly a little bit under the radar. For me, they've always been kind of, let's just say the Scottie Pippins of the wine world for these brands. It's like BV's got the Georges de Latour, which is one of Napa's most iconic, you could say probably the first cult Cabernet to ever come out of the New World. So that would be its Michael Jordan. Whereas the Tapestry is kind of like the Scottie Pippen, like it does the dirty work. It's a star on its own. And then with Penfolds, almost kind of the same situation. You have the rock star, their legendary wine, Penfolds Grange, which is absolutely the most iconic, significant, probably cult wine ever in Australia, completely changed the whole wine industry there. So that would be their Michael Jordan. And the 389 is sometimes referred to as the baby Grange. So this will be a great dive into these two wines that, for me as a wine director, running wine programs, they've always been on almost every list I've written because they offer amazing bang for the buck. They're not cheap, but what is in the bottle drinks like something that is 4 or 5 times the price. So this is a fun one. Julie, did you want to talk anything about like the two wines in general before we kind of dive in and bring in our guest?
Well, I just think of these two wines as being absolutely iconic. Well, the producers are iconic and very formulaic in developing the regions that they come from. You can't think about Napa Valley without the synonymous BV and Andrei Chelichev, which we'll dive into. And same with Australia. I don't think of Australia without thinking of Penfolds. So I think these two producers are iconic and for the region themselves, and definitely did a lot to develop these regions. So with that, should we bring in essentially, arguably, an expert on both of these wines? Should we bring in Jillian and have her help us tell these stories?
Well, first off, it's no argument at all. To me, it is an absolute honor to share a video screen with a dear friend, Jillian Balance, fellow master sommelier. And, we've been lucky enough to travel the world, share stages. So here we are traveling remote and getting a chance to connect this way. So it is a true honor to introduce everyone to Jillian Balance, Master Sommelier for Treasury Wine Estates, and I believe like Senior Education Director Americas or some corporate awesome title like that. Make the card bigger. I like that. But Jillian, welcome to the Two Bottle Tasting Series.
Thank you. I love the concept. And thank you to Mastro's for the great food. Thanks to our wineries for the great wines. And thank you to the Wine Spectator. This is a really cool format, given the circumstances and the current situation of the world. I've also been working the New York Wine Experience for 22 years. So, I am a huge fan of all things Spectator. So that said, it is a thrill to present these wines. I feel very blessed. I started my career at Windows on the World in the World Trade Center. And we had a page of Penfolds Grange. We had a page of Beaulieu Vineyards, Georges de Latour and Tapestry Reserve. And so it's great for this to come full circle for me and have just a really amazing job and opportunity to be able to present these and be an ambassador for exactly what Julie said, like these iconic wineries that really represent the place that they come from.
Fantastic.
Awesome. Keith, I'm curious your point of view. Growing up in Napa Valley, I bet you have some really amazing stories about BV and Andrei Chelichev. Would you care to tell us just a brief history of BV, and Jillian, chime in as well? I'm curious your point of view as well. I bet you have a lot of stories that never made the history books about BV and Andrei Chelichev.
Yeah. It's one of those things that's kind of easy to take for granted. And for me, it was like growing up there, I didn't really appreciate the place as much as possible. But I've always been reminded of just how stunningly beautiful and magical the valley is. And I love that when George de la Tour and his wife first came to the valley, and supposedly to Rutherford, and she looks out and she's like, "Oh my gosh, this is a beautiful spot or beautiful land, Beaulieu," and that kind of just stuck. And it is just one of those places that whenever I kind of need to recharge, there's always that going back home. And just the history of this winery that's been running for now over 100 years continuous, which is amazing. And I just love like little things, like they started with being in the cream of tartar business. And
if they ever need to acidify, they've got plenty of no, just kidding.
Yeah, or if they want to bake, they can make some awesome cookies, I bet, too. But I love that it's like started from that, then started with like one purchase, and I love that it was like BV Ranch 1, and then like, okay, we'll get the next place, we'll call it number 2. And just a quick digression, but I love like when we dive into Penfolds, it's kind of the same thing. Like the bins were just the locations in the winery. So there was like bin 1, bin 2. So I love kind of the practicality, and maybe that's the secret to surviving in the wine industry for over 100 years. But super iconic, would drive by it all the time, driving up Highway 29. But it wasn't until years later that I really got to go there, walk through, see like the old redwood tanks that they were using for fermentation, which were like super cool. You're like, oh, duh, why aren't people using redwood for that? But things changed dramatically coming out of Prohibition, and they were in a really good shape because I don't know how they pulled it off, but they got the contract with the Catholic Church to provide communion wine.
So they didn't go out of business during Prohibition like so many other wineries.
No, they were kind of like big pharma during 2020. They actually made money while everyone else was losing money. So they actually came out of Prohibition in phenomenal shape. And in 1938, they decided that they wanted to kind of up the game, and kind of through friends and recommendations, they got introduced to Andrei Chelichev. And he was just coming out of wine school and was this fiery, passionate person that brought kind of old world wine tech and like modern science together in Napa. And just so many little things that we take for granted in Napa right now. He was really the guy who kind of came up with the recipe, the same way like Julia Childs would be like the first kind of bring French cooking to the US and make it accessible. I would say Andrei was like the first one to kind of make winemaking, modern, yet really world-class and in California.
And so it's interesting because you say that he is responsible for so many things that are what we take for granted now. Jillian, in your opinion, what are some of those things that Andrei Chelichev gave to the wine industry that we don't even think about anymore?
Clean wineries. I mean, he really did a lot of research on bacterial spoilage back in the day. And yeah, that is certainly something that we take for granted. Temperature control during fermentations, things like that are, standard today, were not being practiced back then. We were also, Beaulieu Vineyards was one of the first to estate bottle, because when Prohibition ended, fortunately enough for George, and smartly for George, we were right near the railroad that would bring wine into San Francisco to be shipped all around the world. And that's really what kind of catapulted Beaulieu Vineyards into the fame that it enjoys today, was the ability to get the wine out there. However, a lot of merchants and people were adding water, diluting the product. And so we were one of the first to kind of estate bottle so that the wine could not be tampered with. And that's just one of many things. And Andre really was very willing to share all of that. There's pictures of even Max Schubert coming over from Penfolds to meet with Andre. And he, is responsible really for giving knowledge to Mike Gergich, to Joe Heitz, to some of the greatest producers here in Napa. So he was very revered. And yeah, like Keith said, bringing the old world winemaking approach and marrying that with science. You said that so well, Keith, because it's true. And also George de la Tour, post-phylloxera, so after phylloxera came back from Europe, he was responsible. He started a nursery that had a grafted rootstock available and was really responsible for providing rootstock to rebuild and replant most of Napa and Sonoma and California. So he also made some great contributions as well. And in addition to bringing Andre here. And I've read, little stories because in our heritage room over here at the winery where we've been making the wine since 1923, we have logbooks of just history notes that Andre made. Apparently, when he came here initially and saw the winery, he wanted to turn around and go back to France.
Oh, no.
What's going on here, So, but George convinced him to stay. And yes, 2 years after Andre started, George passed away, which is what paved the way for the commemorative George de la Tour bottling to pay homage to him. So. And during Prohibition, yes, survival happened because wineries were going out of business. People were selling off their vineyards or converting into other crops. And so George really took advantage of that situation and was able to collect around 1,100 acres here in Napa through the 60s. Beaulieu Vineyards was. Our main two properties, however, Ranch 1 and 2, and we always joke about how sexy those names are. But those are really right on the Rutherford bench. And they have been the source and the for George de la Tour and Tapestry Reserve and our Rutherford Cabernet for a very long time. Obviously, for George since 1900. Tapestry we started making in the 80s. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of Tapestry, should we taste it?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, and as we're diving into the tasting, for me, one thing that talking about the vineyards and Andre, I always thought it was really fascinating that he was one of the first people that kind of said, let's focus on getting good grapes into making wine. And I think it's fascinating that that wasn't a given, and supposedly he was one of the first people to kind of like, wait, I'll tell you when to pick the grapes, not you just bring them in when you want to pick them and I'll buy them. So I thought that was pretty interesting that he was one of the first to kind of do quality control in the vineyard. And it sounds like, George de la Tour was also amazing about getting the right clonal selections, the right, root stocks, and having it all start at that.
Speaking of Tapestry, should we taste this wine? One thing I'm really excited about in general is with both of these wines actually is that blends are really hot right now. And so especially with the BV or the Tapestry, because it's a Cabernet dominated blend, I can sell it either as a Cabernet or as a blend. What was the inspiration behind Tapestry, Jillian? Can you tell us?
Sure. Tapestry was intended to mimic a traditional Bordeaux blend, right? Where you have Cabernet Sauvignon as your base. You have the earlier ripening Merlot to kind of soften the tannins. You have Cabernet Franc for a little bit of perfume and texture, Malbec for color, Petit Verdot for some spice. This was really meant to kind of emulate the great red Bordeauxs of France, which are in fact blends, right? At the end of the day. We do put enough Cabernet Sauvignon in the wine to legally label it Cabernet Sauvignon, but Tapestry Reserve was chosen, the name, to give us flexibility in the blending. But it is supposed to, mimic a finely woven tapestry. All of the elements are supposed to come together. And this was the first wine that I put on by the glass at Windows on the World. Dating myself a little bit there, but it's true. I thought that I was bringing Napa Valley, the very best of Napa Valley, to all of our, New York City international diners. And so I have my love affair with this wine goes pretty far back.
Well, and it's funny that you say that, Jillian, because I completely agree, and I've poured it by the glass as well at a few spots. But what I've always loved about it is it's so just drinkable right away. And I kind of feel like, to me, it's almost like, some ways, like if you look at ports, you have vintage ports that need forever to come around, but you can drink like your LBVs while you wait for the vintage. And in some ways, I felt like Tapestry was the LBV. Like I can just crush this while I wait for the George de Latour, which will age for a really long time. Not saying that this won't. It's just it's so drinkable right out of the gate. And I've
definitely meant to be, our most approachable in our Napa Valley range, aside from our Napa Valley Cabernet. But yeah, to your point, George is always in the high 90s for Cabernet Sauvignon, which would require a little bit more time. And this has a lot of like just real fleshy kind of, juicy fruit, even though we're not entirely sourcing from here in Rutherford, which I consider to be kind of that like real valley floor, very rich, very opulent fruit. Most of the fruit does come from Rutherford, and we're trying to kind of maintain that identity with this AVA because it is so important to the Beaulieu Vineyard legacy, I guess I should say.
Love how supple it is. You really get even though it's Cabernet driven, there's something very plushy about it, making the Merlot sort of come through. And to your point about the aromatics, Jillian, the florality that the Cabernet Franc is lending is really, really pretty in this wine.
Yeah, it's, I think this vintage is, let me see, check my notes. We have so many wines in our portfolio. I don't keep it memorized. 3% Cab Franc. So, and of course, long barrel aging, 22 months really helps to integrate everything, right? And give you that really kind of seamless polished texture. We also have some unique techniques in the winery, like literally whole berry in the barrel fermentations, right? So the weight of the top berries gently press down on the bottom ones, and we start this inter-barrel fermentation, which is quite unique. And there's a few cult producers here in the valley that also do that. We just do it on a much larger scale.
For all the fruit or just Cabernet Sauvignon?
All the fruit, but just a portion of it. Because we like to really mix things up and make it complicated. It can't just be one type of French oak that we're fermenting in anymore these days. We have to have fancy concrete tanks and stainless steel and oak, and give us that whole different textures from all those fermentation vessels.
Yeah, well, I love too how you guys have like the whole new like secret small winery within the big winery. So it's almost like your own little cult winery. Like it's almost like a speakeasy. Like you need to figure out where to find it within BV, but then it's like the cool, like, oh, look at all the fancy expensive barrels and like the cool like rack spinners. So that way you can do so I love that you guys have that scale to make a bunch of wine at a great price, but then you have like the super, Skunk Works boutique little side of it as well. And, speaking of Rutherford, I love too that you guys are right there. And that Rutherford house where you're filming from, if it looks familiar, is one of like the most magical places in the valley. But I love too that you can taste a little bit of that Rutherford dust. And I have to think Andre Chelichev was probably awesome at nicknames. Like you and I both know Fred Dame is pretty good at giving people nicknames, but I bet Chelichev was even better, because to come up with like a slogan like Rutherford Dust, it's so unbelievably perfect. Because when you're there walking the vineyards, it's like, this is, and then you taste it and it's super cool.
Yeah. And he really believed that in Rutherford, this was one of the very best places in the world to make great Cabernet. And he was right. And sadly, the Rutherford Dust Society was founded after he passed away, but it was definitely a term that he coined. And for Trevor Durling, he's the fourth chief winemaker that we've had in 120 years. Great guy, very, very talented. He calls it like a cocoa powder texture on the finish. For me in blind tastings, it's always a little bit of this kind of chalky thing, but dust sounds so much sexier, so you're right. Andre nailed it. And it is that really unique texture. Very fine, kind of cocoa powdery, dusty finish, which I love. I find it very, very appealing, especially with food, and I'm sure that your customers that are picking up their fantastic Mastro's steaks, I'm a little jealous, to be honest, because our closest one is in San Francisco. So anyway.
Yeah.
Well, let's head south, you guys.
All right. So I think that's actually maybe a very interesting segue that you've said, it's 5 winemakers who have ever made George de Latour or BV's winemakers. I think Penfolds actually even had less than that who've made Grange. Is that correct?
Yeah, 4 exactly. And Peter Gago is our current chief winemaker and has been since 2008, but started with the winery several years prior. And he is carrying the torch and continuing our great legacy of making Grange and all of the Penfolds wines.
And so Max Schubert, he was a contemporary of Chelichev, is that right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And they knew each other. Was there like any mentorship involved?
We've been trying to track that historically. We only have some photographs of Max visiting here in the winery in the late 60s before Andre retired. So Andre retired in 75 or 76 and then came back in the 90s to make George de Latour again. And then he passed away 3 years later. So yes, Max was here visiting. Max was the chief winemaker for Penfolds from 1936 also till the mid 70s. So both of them have this incredible longevity with both properties and mentoring, future winemakers.
So Jillian, give us the 5-second spiel on Penfolds. Is there a 5-second? Like 1844, is that right? They've been around and they started off making a lot of port and dessert wines, like most wineries in Australia. Is that right?
Well, yeah, historically, right, during Prohibition and during the World Wars, people liked very sticky, sweet, strong wines. They needed to get the buzz quickly. So there was certainly, quantity and strength over quality, right? But actually, Dr. Penfolds did move over from the UK in 1844, and he established a medical practice. Part of what he would prescribe would be these tinctures that were made from wine and fortified wine for curing insomnia, dysentery. You got to imagine like all these people traveling back and forth via ship, all kind of the stuff that probably went around. So he became very, very famous in Australia for his tinctures. And by the end of the 1800s, it was the largest wine company in Australia and the most exported. Wow. And, the rest is history. It was really Max Schubert who transitioned Penfolds into the modern day and, convinced the powers that be that still red wine, still white wine was going to be what was in the future. People would tire of these stickies, and you had a lot of soldiers fighting in World War II that would go to France and Italy, very similar parallels to the United States, and come back with this thirst for more refined, higher quality wine. So it was a slow transition, but it started in the 50s for Penfolds, certainly with the iconic Penfolds Grange being produced in 1951. And then 389, which we're about to try, was not too far after. So this is the 60th vintage of Bin 389, which was intended to be a Cabernet, Sauvignon, and Shiraz blend. At the time, there was not a lot of Cabernet planted in Australia. Shiraz was and still is the darling varietal because it's Southern Hemisphere, it's warm, it produces this wine of great character and complexity. So, Penfolds was very instrumental in, I would say, developing South Australia, the Coonawarra area, Limestone Coast, Rattenbully, Pathway, those GIs over there that produce really phenomenal Cabernet Sauvignon or grow really phenomenal Cab. So we expanded a lot of vineyards during that time. And that's how we were able to amp up production of 389. Thank goodness, because, the world is thirsting for it. And hopefully your viewers are as well. But I love Australian wine. I find a very savory characteristic to the wines, whether it's Shiraz or Cabernet. Just there's this kind of savory, spicy note that is unmistakably Australia. You definitely get the warmth and the, I don't want to say jammy, but the really ripe fruits of the Barossa Valley. And then you get the kind of restraint from Limestone Coast, cooler climate Cabernet Sauvignon. And I think the two just blend beautifully together.
I think one of my favorite sayings that I've heard was from Jancis Robinson. And she's like, Australian wines, you can taste the sun. And there's something about that always just makes me kind of smile, because you pick it up and you're like, there's just a little bit of an exuberance. And, it's kind of like the Australians, the Aussies that I've met, like you never not know someone is Australian. Like if they're in the room, you're like, that's the Aussie. And I kind of just love that just gregarious, extroverted type, not to stereotype, but a lot of Aussies I've met are that way. And I don't know, I just think that, it's just a fascinating story how the Barossa was German immigrants, kind of very similar to California, where they got there, realized it was a beautiful place to grow grapes, bringing their old world traditions, and then to see kind of going to the 50s and like Max Schubert. And I love that he was over in Portugal on kind of like a trip in 48 to kind of refine port making sweet wines. And he and one of the Portuguese winemakers did a little side trip over to Bordeaux, and they kind of tasted some of the old Bordeaux's, fell in love with it, and went, I think I could do this when I go back home. And it's fascinating that Max went back to Australia, basically created Grange. And then the guy in Portugal went back and created Barcavellia, which is the legendary kind of first dry red coming out of Portugal. And I just, as you and I have been on wine trips together, Julie, you and I, it's funny how like, who knows what might come out of those things, but there is something about visiting places. And I think also too, they probably tried some old Bordeaux's that might've had some Cabernet and Syrah mixed with it, because that was the legendary best blend of the 1800s. Yeah. And like, there was actually Chateau Laffitte's labeled as Chateau Lafite Hermitage that actually sold for more money than just Chateau Lafite. So there is a precedent for doing Cabernet and Syrah, Shiraz together. Yeah.
And then just a quick note on the bin. So that means batch identification number. And just as you mentioned, it literally was the area in the winery where they were storing, hey, Bob, where's that Shiraz from Barossa, from our, Kalimna vineyard? Oh, that's in bin 28 or whatever. So, and then it just kind of stuck. It's a marketing nightmare because we have so many bins. We'll have regularly 20 or so in circulation at any given time. But when you go to Australia, you understand that the bin wines and Penfolds, it's like they're like children to people, in Australia. They collect specific bin wines, and each one does represent something, be it multi-regional blending, or multi-grape blend, or using French oak versus American oak. I mean, this 389, I'm sure you guys picked up on the American oak. Eh?
American, yeah.
And, historically, Australians are pretty, cheap. They had good trade relations with the U.S., so they didn't see the need to buy French barrels. So that kind of experimentation, and certainly that being a big part of our program, didn't happen until, probably the 80s or so, I would say. We still have huge American oak vats in the winery, too.
Yeah,
but you get that sensation on the nose, that real coconut kind of thing.
Yeah, but it's like raw, like fresh coconut, or, really expensive Tahitian vanilla ice cream, like those like $10 little mini gelato pints. Like it's got that just exaggerated vanilla coconut that's delicious because it's got the fruit to go with it.
And then I don't think it's overbearing. I think it's well integrated and really beautifully woven in.
Yeah, I mean, Shiraz does, as a varietal, marries very well with American.
Yeah, and Jillian, what was that?
The tannins are different when you age in American oak versus French. So.
Yeah, and what were you saying yesterday about how Cabernet and Syrah come together? Like, what was the Aussie explanation on it?
Well, our winemaking team has this, what they say about 389 is when you do a 50-50 blend like this, if you're not blending other varietals in with Cabernet, it seems a little incomplete. They call it like a donut, and Syrah is the donut hole that kind of fills in the middle palate and gives you a little bit more structure to the wine, and again, just kind of fleshes it out. So you can definitely see, like I said, the cool climate Cabernet Sauvignon, the black currant and all that, but then you also see the real plummy, spicy characteristics of Shiraz, and they do marry together quite well.
Yeah.
And this is a style that can't be imitated. I mean, we are the true pioneers of blending these varietals together, and I just think it's such a unique offering. I mean, both of the wines really, and I like to say that you're kind of drinking history when you try these wines, and you really do get a sense of place, and you get a sense of this history and pedigree that's behind what's in the bottle.
Yeah, well, I hope you guys can find this photo and show it, because I know there's old shots of McGill Estate, and it's amazing because it's the old winery, the vineyard, and then it's just other vineyards and land around it. But if you go there now, it's like completely, the city is built up around it. And I love that it's like the vineyard kind of in the middle of the city with this like old ancient winery. And it's kind of just such a good dichotomy of past and present coming together.
Fighting the urban sprawl, Yeah.
The
McGill Estate used to be so large, and now it's just gradually shrunk. And they actually, at the winery, they have a map of the old vineyards and today, aerial maps, so you can see how much it's shrunk down. But I think also during that time, like we had expanded into the Barossa Valley, so we have another winery in Noreuta, probably because of that, because we were losing the fight. But I think what also is really cool about visiting McGill is that you can still go into the Grange family home. So Mary Penfolds, who was married to Dr. Penfolds, Grange was the name of her homestead in the UK. And so that was the name of their home, and that was also the name of the iconic wine that we produce. But he still got his doctor's office all set up with little tinctures, doctor's bag, little prescription sheets, It's been very, very well preserved, and what a neat, like, unique piece of history that gives us all. And you're right, Julie, like, you don't pick up a wine book and not see the name Penfolds when it comes to Australia, or even, some of the most iconic wineries in the world.
Keith, what are we offering as a pairing for these wines?
Well, this should be kind of fun because the Master's Kit is actually, it's kind of like a mixed grill. So what's better than one steak? How about two steaks? Yes. So in this case,
cuts.
Yes, exactly. So I believe there is a filet, which I think that lush, supple texture that you talked about with the tapestry should be perfect with the filet. And then a New York, which has got a little bit more,
marbling,
chewiness, a little more chewy,
flavorness, deliciousness, which should go spectacular with the 389, and the fact that it is a little bit, burlier in a good way. So, Jillian, what do you like with these wines? I mean, you sell them, and you're out in the markets a lot.
Oh my gosh! I mean, I think they're pretty versatile. Like, steak is the obvious choice, right? Because you have all that protein and fat kind of coating your palate, and then you wash it away with some nice sturdy red. That's always perfect. Rack of lamb is also great, especially if you think about using some savory herbs and kind of picking up on that savory note of the 389. Here in Napa, we sit outside in 100-degree weather and chug Tapestry. We don't even really need anything. Just kidding.
We do that here in Houston too. It can be 1,000 degrees outside.
It's done all over the United States. That's why Cabernet is king, right? There's demand and people, doesn't matter. But I do think the Tapestry is really elegant. Like, you could even have this with some roasted pork loin, or even a beautiful roasted chicken, with a nice, like, kind of savory sauce. It's great with even like vegetarian things with pasta. So very, very versatile.
Well, fantastic.
On that note,
I have a quiz for you all.
Oh God.
Wow.
Master Sommelier, Advanced Sommelier. Which cluster is Cabernet and which cluster is Merlot?
Merlot is the one in your left hand. Cabernet is in your right hand.
This is
is it turned around? Yeah.
Here, let me turn it around. I'm going to make earrings later.
Nice. And can we see the one on
Keith, what do you think?
Let's see the tighter cluster. No, that's the looser cluster, which does look a little bit. Was it Clone 4 that's the looser cluster?
They're both Cabernet.
Yeah, it's like it's 4 and 6, right?
This is 4 and this is 6.
Yeah.
And I do truly hope that your guests enjoy these wines. Most importantly, not just with great food, but with loved ones. I think that's why we're all in this business, right? Because we get to enjoy great wine, great food with people that we love. And that, for me, is a large part of life. So I'm doing it virtually with you guys, just so you know. And in the hopes that, and for everybody tuning in, that we see you out here in Napa soon.
Jillian, thank you so much for joining us today. This was really awesome to get your insight, your stories, all the history. This really helps build a more solid picture of both of these wines. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Jillian. Hopefully next time it will not be virtual. And, look forward to getting you back on the stage for Pigs and Pinot as we take it to Fred. So.
Yay.
Cheers.
Cheers.